When I bought my camper, I wasn't thinking about neighborhood politics. I was thinking about road trips, starry skies, and spontaneous getaways. It was my little escape pod from the daily grind. I worked hard for it, saved up, and finally brought it home like a trophy. I parked it on the side of my driveway, just like I'd seen plenty of people do in other neighborhoods. At first, I didn't think twice. I wasn't blocking the sidewalk. It didn't stick out onto the street. I made sure it was clean, no leaks, and definitely not some rusted-out hunk of metal. Honestly, it looked pretty nice sitting there. It made me feel proud. Then came the first side eye. It was subtle. Just a neighbor walking their dog, an older guy I'd seen before but never spoken to, who slowed down just long enough to squint at my camper like it was some kind of alien landing pod. I gave him a polite nod. He didn't nod back. Just kept walking. The next day, I found a note. Not an official one, just a piece of printer paper folded in half and tucked under my windshield wiper. It said, "Please be mindful of community standards. This isn't an RV park." No name. No signature. Just that passive-aggressive line, like it came from someone who's never been told no in their life. I crumpled it up and tossed it. Didn't even think to keep it. Maybe I should have. See, I live in a neighborhood with an HOA, yeah, I know. When I moved in, I figured it'd just be about lawn care and streetlights. Nothing major. But I learned real quick that some HOAs aren't just about rules, they're about control. And mine? It was run by a guy named Glenn. Glenn was the kind of person who seemed like he was born in a polo shirt. Always just dropping by to remind people of bylaws. Always the first to complain if a trash bin was left out for more than 30 minutes. His lawn was the greenest on the block, probably because he was too busy watching everyone else's to let his own go dry. Now at this point, I still hadn't talked to Glenn about the camper. I wasn't even sure if it was him behind the note. But the vibe in the neighborhood started shifting. One neighbor I used to chat with at the mailbox suddenly acted distant. Another who waved every morning suddenly didn't. And then, 3 days later, I got the email. It came from the HOA board. The subject line was simple. Non-compliant vehicle violation. My heart sank a little. According to Section 12.4 of the HOA guidelines, recreational vehicles may not be stored in driveways or visible from the street for more than 24 hours. You are required to remove the vehicle within 48 hours to avoid penalties, including towing. Towing? Seriously? I read it again. Then I pulled up the guidelines. I swear I had read through the rules before I moved in. But this clause? It was buried deep in a wall of legal jargon. No big bold letters. No warning signs. Just there in the fine print. Still, I wasn't trying to start a war. I figured I'd be reasonable about it. I replied to the email asking if I could speak to someone about a temporary exception. I explained that I only planned to keep the camper in the driveway for a couple of weeks while I installed some upgrades. I was even willing to park it in my backyard for a while if needed. It would be tight, but doable. No reply. Instead, 2 days later, I found another note. This time, taped right to the camper door. This is your final notice. Remove the vehicle by 9 a.m. Friday or it will be towed at your expense. That was it. No conversation. No meeting. Just an ultimatum. Now I'll be honest, I still wasn't ready to go full scorched earth. Not yet. I thought maybe it was just a miscommunication, some overzealous enforcement. So I decided to do what good neighbors do. I walked over to the next HOA board meeting. Big mistake. The meeting was held in the community center, and as soon as I walked in, it felt like I was crashing a country club brunch. Glenn was seated at the head of the table, smug as ever, flanked by a few board members who looked like they hadn't cracked a smile since the Cold War. I introduced myself, explained my situation, and asked, very politely, if there was any flexibility. I wasn't trying to bend the rules, I just wanted some common sense to apply. Glenn didn't even let me finish before he chimed in. We have to maintain standards. If we allow your camper, what's next? Boats? Trailers? Broken down trucks? This is a neighborhood, not a junkyard. I blinked. My camper's not broken down, I replied. It's in great condition. And I'm just asking for a little time. He leaned back in his chair and gave me a half smile. The kind that says you already lost. You should have read the rules more carefully when you moved in. That was the moment I realized it wasn't about the camper. It wasn't even about the rule. It was about him. About power. About setting an example. I walked out of that meeting with my blood boiling. I felt embarrassed, talked down to, and completely unheard. Still, I held out hope that maybe they wouldn't actually tow it. Maybe it was just a threat. But Friday came, and the camper was gone. No knock. No phone call. Just gone. They really did it. And that's when something inside me snapped. Because if they thought I was just going to roll over, pay the fee, and move on like a good little resident, they didn't know who they were messing with. I wish I could say I calmly handled it when I saw the empty driveway. But the truth is, I stood there for a solid minute, just staring at the spot where my camper used to be, mouth slightly open, fists clenched, brain still trying to catch up. They actually did it. I grabbed my phone, scrolled through my emails, and reread every message from the HOA. There was no confirmation. No mention of who they hired to tow it. No paperwork. Nothing. They just took it. I called the number listed on the last notice, but of course, it went straight to voicemail. Classic. So I drove to the HOA office, a little building tucked behind the tennis courts with that same beige stucco and fake potted plants vibe. Locked. Closed for the day. I knocked anyway. Banged, actually. I wasn't trying to be polite anymore. A woman poked her head out from the office next door and said, "If you're looking for Glenn, he only comes in on Tuesdays." It was Friday. I took a deep breath and tried to steady my voice. "Do you know where my camper was towed?" She shrugged. "He probably had it taken to that lot off of Broadview. They use it for most removals." She said it like this was some everyday occurrence. Like, oh yeah, he probably just had your camper disappeared like a pizza delivery. No big deal. I drove to the Broadview lot, which, ironically, looked way worse than my neighborhood ever could. Potholes, broken fencing, half the vehicles looked like they'd been sitting there since the early 2000s. And yep, there it was. My camper. Parked between a rusted-out sedan and a boat with no trailer. I had to pay $380 to get it out. $380. For the privilege of being treated like a criminal on my own property. Now here's the part that really got me. When I asked the towing company who authorized the removal, they showed me the paperwork. Guess whose signature was on it? Glenn's. Not a group vote. Not a board decision. Just him. I should have seen it coming. Glenn always had that smug confidence, like he knew he'd never be held accountable for anything. But this felt personal. So I started digging. First, I checked the HOA bylaws. I knew about the RV clause now, but I wanted to see how this happened so fast. Turns out, buried even deeper in the document was a section that gave the HOA president emergency authority to act without a vote in cases where community standards were at immediate risk. Immediate risk? From a camper? Yeah. I could practically see Glenn twisting that clause like it was made of taffy. But the real kicker? That clause required him to file a report within 48 hours explaining his actions to the board and notifying the homeowner. I never got a report. I never got anything. So technically, Glenn had broken his own HOA's rules. That gave me an idea. I emailed the board directly, not just Glenn, but every other member listed. I laid everything out, the lack of notice, the unauthorized use of emergency powers, the missing report, and the fact that I'd been left in the dark until my property was already gone. I included photos, scanned copies of the towing invoice, timestamps, everything. I expected silence. But I didn't expect what actually happened. 2 board members responded the next day, and not to defend Glenn. Their tone was cautious, even slightly apologetic. One of them, Barbara, wrote, "Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We were unaware of any enforcement action involving your property. This matter should have come before the board." That's when it clicked. Glenn hadn't just made a bad call, he'd gone rogue. And worse? He'd done it behind the backs of the very people who were supposed to keep him in check. I wasn't the only one he'd steamrolled. I decided to attend the next board meeting again, but this time, I brought backup. Over the weekend, I knocked on doors. I talked to neighbors, people who I thought had turned cold, but really, they were just scared of being Glenn's next target. One guy told me Glenn fined him $200 for having decorative gravel that didn't match the approved shade. Another woman had her front garden dug up because the plants weren't on the HOA's official landscape list. People weren't just annoyed with Glenn, they hated him. They were just afraid to say anything. But now I had a story that got their attention. At the board meeting, Glenn tried to run things like normal, tight agenda, fast talking, pushing people through like he was doing us all a favor by even being there. But then I stood up and requested time to speak. He rolled his eyes. "This isn't the time for personal grievances," Barbara interrupted. "He's on the agenda." That wiped the smirk right off his face. I laid it all out, calm, direct, with printed copies for the board. I walked them through the sequence of events, the violation of their own rules, and the financial impact it had on me. I stopped short of threatening legal action, but I didn't have to. The message was loud and clear. Glenn tried to deflect. He pulled the community standards card again. Said I was being dramatic. That he had the right to protect the neighborhood from falling into chaos. That's when another resident stood up. Then another. Then another. It was like a dam breaking. People started airing all their Glenn grievances right there. Fees for trash bins, threats over Christmas lights, harassment for unapproved flags. One man had a literal binder full of fines and photos from Glenn's personal phone. He called it the Glenn file. By the time it was over, Glenn looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. The board promised a full internal review. But I didn't stop there. Because while I was researching Glenn's camper stunt, I found something very interesting. Tucked away in the HOA records was a little note about a storage unit they rented out near the clubhouse. Not an official facility, just a metal shipping container they used for storing lawn equipment, event gear, and even old paper files. It was parked behind the HOA office, technically on common property, but not zoned for permanent storage. And guess what? It had no permit. You see where this is going, right? I wasn't just going to take my camper and move on. Oh no. They towed my property without warning? Fine. Next up? I towed theirs, with all the paperwork to back it up. Let's just say, I had a plan. You ever have that moment where you know you're technically in the right, but you're still the one getting punished? Yeah. That was me, watching Glenn walk out of that HOA meeting like he hadn't just been exposed in front of half the neighborhood. No apology. No explanation. No consequences, at least not yet. And that's when I knew. If I wanted justice, I had to get creative. They crossed the line when they towed my camper. Not with a vote, not with a warning, not even with a shred of respect, but with a sneaky, ego-driven power play. And I wasn't about to let that slide. Especially not after I found out about that illegally placed storage unit the HOA used behind their office. You know the kind, those big, steel shipping containers people convert into temporary sheds or portable garages. This one was dented, painted a dull gray, and practically sinking into the gravel behind the building. I'd never noticed it before, but once I knew what it was, and more importantly, that it had 0 permits on file, it became a flashing red target. So I started documenting. Quietly. Over the next week, I took photos. Day, night, weekends. I got footage of board members going in and out of it, even watched them store boxes of old meeting records and fold up event tables inside. I ran a quick check with the county zoning office. No permit filed. No temporary structure approved. Boom. The very people who fine neighbors for unauthorized Halloween decorations, or running an off-the-books storage facility behind their own office. You can't make this stuff up. So here's what I did. First, I filed a formal complaint with the zoning board. Not anonymously either. I signed it with my full name, attached the photos, and clearly stated what the container was being used for. Then I sent a courtesy copy to the HOA board, just to let them know, in case they forgot to file that permit. Of course, Glenn didn't respond. But Barbara did. She called me personally. "Look, I know this thing with the camper got out of hand," she said. "But can we just find a way to resolve this without escalating further?" "Escalating?" I said. "You towed my private property without a board vote or proper notice. Now I'm reporting an unpermitted structure sitting on public land. If that's escalation, maybe you should ask yourself who started the war." She didn't say anything after that. A few days later, a zoning inspector came by. Not even trying to be subtle, clipboard, vest, marked car, and everything. He snapped pictures, asked a few questions. I just waved at him from my driveway with a big OL grin on my face. I could practically hear Glenn screaming through the HOA walls. But I wasn't done. Because I also discovered something else. The HOA didn't actually own the land the container was on. It was technically part of a utility easement, city property, leased under specific terms that prohibited permanent or semi-permanent storage. The lease terms were public record. I printed them out. Now I had the zoning department and the city's code enforcement team involved. All within a week. And then I made the final call. Not to the city. Not to the HOA. To a private towing company. Same kind of operation Glenn used on me, except I was playing by the book. I sent them everything, the photos, the zoning violation, the city easement documentation. The container was clearly in breach. And since it was technically city property, and not registered to any private owner, they had grounds to remove it, after filing a notice, of course. 3 days later, they showed up with a flatbed truck, a forklift, and 2 guys who looked like they ate metal for breakfast. I wasn't even trying to be sneaky. I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee as they backed up, tilted the lift, and hoisted the entire container like it weighed nothing. The chains clinked, the steel creaked, and within 20 minutes, the thing was strapped down and ready to go. Glenn came running, literally sprinting, from the HOA office. "What the hell are you doing?" he yelled at the workers. The driver calmly handed him the paperwork. "Per city code. You're in violation of zoning. We were authorized to remove it." Glenn looked at me like I'd personally ruined his life. I gave him a little 2-finger salute and said, "Careful, Glenn. I hear unpermitted structures are a danger to the community standard." He was fuming. Face red, lips trembling, trying to form words that wouldn't come. You could see the gears in his head turning, trying to figure out who to blame, who to call, how to spin this so he didn't look like a complete joke. Too late. Neighbors were filming. Kids were laughing. Even Barbara stepped outside just in time to see the truck roll away with the container. Poetic. Later that night, someone slid a note under my door. No name, no signature. Just a single line, written in capital letters. "You've gone too far." I laughed. Too far? They broke into my peace, my property, my freedom to enjoy the home I worked for, and I went too far? Nah. I went exactly as far as I needed to go. And Glenn? He still didn't get it. Because I wasn't done yet. Not even close. I didn't sleep much the night after the container was hauled off. Not because I was worried, far from it. I was buzzing. That kind of adrenaline only comes when you know you've flipped the script. For once, Glenn and the rest of the HOA weren't the ones holding the power. I was. And it felt damn good. But here's the thing. That wasn't the end of it. Not even close. Because when the city removed that first container, I found out something very interesting. Apparently, that wasn't the only off-the-books storage Glenn and his board were using. There was another one, this time a proper shed, but built without a permit, on land that was technically HOA-owned, but never cleared for development in the bylaws. It was sitting at the far end of the community park, tucked behind some trees and a dilapidated fence. You'd never even know it was there unless someone told you. Someone did tell me. A former HOA board member reached out anonymously. Just a brief email. If you think that container was bad, check out the shed behind the park. Built without approval. Stored junk in there for years. So the next morning, I took a walk. I wasn't even trying to be sneaky. I walked right up to the locked gate and looked through the slats. Sure enough, there it was, another oversized shed, stuffed to the brim with old folding chairs, banners, broken holiday decorations, and God knows what else. Dusty. Moldy. Forgotten. And illegal. But what got me wasn't just the shed. It was the smugness. The hypocrisy. This was the same HOA that made me pull my mailbox post 6 inches to the left because it was off-center. And yet here they were, building structures in secret, holding neighborhood junk like they were running a back-alley flea market. So I started digging. Turns out the HOA was never authorized to spend money on that shed in the first place. There were no budget line items. No votes. No receipts. Nothing. Which meant they either built it with untracked funds, or someone paid for it out of pocket to avoid detection. Either way, it was ripe for the taking. So I did what any reasonable, overly towed homeowner would do. I got myself a commercial towing license. Okay, technically I didn't become a towing operator overnight. But I did partner with a local guy named Rico, who owned a private towing business and loved sticking it to bureaucrats. Once I told him what happened to my camper, he grinned ear to ear. You tell me when and where, he said. I'll bring the flatbed. And just like that, the plan was in motion. Now I'm not stupid. I knew I couldn't just yank the shed off the ground like a Lego block. But I also knew that the foundation was temporary. The HOA hadn't poured concrete. It was just resting on elevated cinder blocks. No anchors. No footer. Nothing to hold it down. With a forklift and some chains, Rico could lift it, tilt it, and pull it straight out. But first, I had to make sure it was legal. I filed another report, this time to the HOA's own Insurance Oversight Committee. Told them about the unpermitted structure, its fire hazards, the risk to community property, and the fact that it was built without resident approval. I CC'd the HOA's legal representative and the city council. I gave them 5 business days to respond. They didn't. So on the 6th day, at precisely 2:17 p.m., Rico and I pulled up to the park with 2 trucks, a small crew, and a whole lot of confidence. Neighbors came out with their phones. Some just watched from their windows. But everyone knew. Word had spread like wildfire after the first container incident. This was the sequel. And this time, I wasn't just calling out the HOA, I was taking their property. Legally. Rico looped the chains around the base, positioned the forklift under the back corner, and with a low mechanical hum, the shed started to lift. It wobbled. Groaned. A piece of rotted wood snapped off the side. Then, slowly it tipped, just enough for Rico to slide the flatbed underneath. It was like watching a magician pull off a trick in broad daylight. And just as we were securing it, guess who came running? Yep. Glenn. He skidded across the grass, nearly tripping over his own loafers. Stop! You can't do this! He shouted, holding up a clipboard like it was a weapon. That's HOA property! Then maybe you should have kept better track of it, I replied, flipping through the report I had printed. No permit. No budget approval. No safety inspection. No community vote. You want to keep it? Take it up with the city. You're stealing, he barked. Rico just laughed and handed him a copy of the removal order. We're reclaiming illegally placed equipment from common land. Fully documented. You're lucky the fire marshal didn't do this first. The crowd was eating it up. Someone even shouted, What's next, Glenn? You hiding a pool under the tennis court? The shed creaked again as it settled onto the truck bed. A gust of wind blew through the trees, and a bunch of old HOA banners fluttered out from under the open door. "Annual Spring Clean-Up Day," they read, with bright pink flowers. The irony was delicious. And then, just to really twist the knife, I did one last thing. I handed Glenn a bill, for the exact towing cost I'd paid when they took my camper. He stared at it like it was radioactive. "What is this?" he asked. "That's your share," I said. "Figured it's only fair." Rico and I drove off with the shed, waving to the neighbors as we passed. People clapped. A few laughed. One guy saluted. And for the first time in months, I felt free. Not just because I'd gotten payback, but because I had finally forced the HOA to play by the same rules they shoved down everyone else's throat. I wasn't being petty. I wasn't being vengeful. I was being fair. And now the whole neighborhood knew it. But the best part? The fallout hadn't even started yet. That was coming next. And oh, it was gonna be beautiful. By the time the shed was halfway across town, the HOA was already imploding. I didn't even make it back to my driveway before my phone blew up with messages. Neighbors. Reporters. Even someone from a local news station who wanted to hear my side of the story. Apparently, someone had live-streamed the entire shed removal, and the video went viral. Thousands of views in under 2 hours. The title? "Man Gets Camper Towed, So He Tows the HOA's Storage Shed in Broad Daylight." Poetic. By sunset, 3 different Facebook groups were sharing screenshots. The subreddit r/PettyRevenge had me pinned on their front page. But while the internet was having a field day, the real fireworks were happening inside the HOA itself. That night, a board meeting was called. Emergency status. I wasn't invited, but that didn't matter. Because 4 people walked out of that meeting and didn't walk back in. 4 board members, including Glenn, resigned on the spot. Apparently, the shed fiasco exposed a lot more than just shady storage practices. My complaints had triggered an internal audit, and things were ugly. Missing funds, unauthorized spending, and a small but disturbing community development fund that no one could explain, except that the last check from it had Glenn's signature and was made out to cash. People were pissed. The residents who had once rolled their eyes or shrugged off the HOA nonsense were suddenly awake. They started asking questions, filing formal requests for financial statements, organizing, demanding transparency. For the first time in years, it felt like we were the ones in charge. And that terrified what was left of the board. So what did they do? They tried to retaliate. I got a letter in the mail a few days later. Not from Glenn, he was gone, but from the interim president, a woman named Cheryl. She claimed my actions constituted theft of HOA property and public disruption. Cute. I responded with a detailed legal summary, courtesy of a very enthusiastic lawyer who had reached out pro bono after seeing the viral video. He wrote the most beautiful cease and desist I've ever read. It ended with, "If further baseless threats are made toward my client, we'll have no choice but to escalate to court proceedings for harassment, abuse of authority, and punitive damages." I never heard from Cheryl again. But even if I had, it wouldn't have mattered. Because something incredible was happening. The entire neighborhood was changing. People who used to avoid HOA meetings like the plague were now showing up early and packing the room. They elected a new board, one that didn't operate like some power-drunk mini-government. These were real people. Parents. Retirees. A high school teacher. And even the guy who ran the taco truck outside the mall. They passed new bylaws. Repealed dumb rules. Got rid of arbitrary fines. And most importantly, they voted to stop using towings as a punishment. All because I got fed up and pushed back. But let me be honest for a second, this wasn't just about me, or my camper, or even the stupid shed. This was about every single person who's ever been bullied by a system that was supposed to protect them. About the idea that just because someone has a clipboard and a laminated name tag doesn't mean they get to stomp on people's lives. I became the example. And yeah, there were moments where I second-guessed myself. When I wondered if towing that shed went too far. If I had just added fuel to the fire instead of solving anything. But then something happened that erased all doubt. I was at the park one evening, same one where the shed used to be, just walking my dog. A guy I'd never met before walked up to me with his 2 kids. He looked nervous at first, then said, "You don't know me, but thanks for what you did. They towed my dad's truck last year while he was visiting from out of town. He never wanted to come back. What you did? That meant something to us." His daughter, maybe 10 or 11, gave me a thumbs up and said, "That was so cool." That moment? That made it all worth it. I didn't just get my revenge, I sparked a movement. And here's the kicker, I never even asked for the shed back. Rico donated it to a local community garden. They turned it into a tool shed, painted it bright green, and named it the People's Storage. I drive by it sometimes and just smile. Meanwhile, my camper? It's still parked in my driveway. Clean, covered, and completely legal. No one messes with it now. No weird notes. No towing trucks. Just peace. As for Glenn? Rumor has it he moved to another state. Someone said he's part of another HOA now, but this time, just a regular member. No clipboard. No power. I hope he's doing some soul searching. Because if there's one thing I learned through all this, it's that bullies only win when no one stands up to them. And the moment you do, everything changes. Would I do it all again? Without hesitation. Because sometimes you don't just fight back for yourself. You fight back for everyone who thought they couldn't. And you make damn sure no one forgets it.